Dr. Narayanan, it's a pleasure to have you over here.
My pleasure, Abhinav. Thank you. I'm very honored to participate.
Thank you. So, you've been at Harvard for 30 years. You did your PhD in accounting from Stanford. You started out from IIM Ahmedabad, and before that, you were in Chennai. I'd love to learn about how cultural influences business. Could you share how the insights that you've gathered from these different cultural contexts has differed and how they have really shaped your thinking?
Yeah, I think culture plays a dramatic influence on both business decisions and personal decisions. And let me give you an example. My experience in the West is people are driven quite a bit by legal agreement, contractual relationships, service level agreements, which is also there in the Indian context. But in my experience in India, things tend to be driven more by a relationship between businesses. And it's not often that they resort to legal mechanisms and courts to settle. It's sort of like, you know, you're at their wedding or their children's wedding, they're at your wedding. And if you don't, if you have some disagreement, things get escalated one level above, and your bosses are buddies and they sort it out. So, this kind of use of informal relationships is much more extensive in India. Likewise, having a network where you do background checks, like, you call up your buddies and you find out how they are to work with. Whereas in the West, it's much more common to just go to the web page. If things are good, you just start working with them. So this use of relationships is a big difference between what I've experienced in India and what I've experienced in the US. Likewise, I see that personal decisions or career choices, which also end up affecting businesses in the long run, are done quite differently. In the US, whenever someone comes to you for career advice, if one of my students comes to go to their professors for advice, the advice they usually get is follow your passion. And whereas in India, the advice tends to be, think about your family circumstance and think about your impact on society and whether what you are doing is like beneficial to society. At least in my family, and I think it's more general than that, growing up in India, like being a doctor or being an engineer or being like a teacher was put on a pedestal because then you can have an impact on a large number of people. And so, I've seen these cultural differences. I try to make sense of these differences by trying to see where is it that the two cultures sort of like agree. So if I'm looking at how should I pursue my own career or what advice I should give my kids, I tell them like, yes, following your passion is important, but among all the things you're passionate about, try to look at things that are very conducive for family life or things that will help you be a very productive contributor of society, make other people happy. So that's where I see cultural differences show up in business decisions, but also individual career choices.
And do you think that a blend of those cultural experiences, from those at Harvard, at Stanford, from Chennai, do you think those experiences have contributed to your enrichment of your business understanding over the years? And if so, how really has it done that?
Absolutely. I think these cultural differences shape your understanding of businesses. And even in the classroom, how I might teach something is shaped by sort of the culture of how things are taught in India and how culture things are taught in the US. I'll just give you an example. Basic accounting, the debits and credits. In India, there are like three rules of, debit what comes in, credit what goes out, and things, rules like that, that you try to memorize and learn those rules and then try to apply them. In the US, we have this accounting equation and we give examples and we just see what is the impact of this journal entry and accounting equations. It's sort of much more example driven and to generalize from those examples. So, what we call inductive learning, whereas
Yeah,
in India, it tends to be a little bit more deductive learning. And I think a happy medium is where I'm most comfortable, where even in the classroom, where people learn in different styles, it's not everyone works the same way. So I look at it and say, if I'm getting stuck on a point with some of my students, I try to say, okay, let's look at it a different way.
yeah,
And when I try to design my course HBS online, I was very much aware of different learning styles, and I was drawing from my experience back in India, what I've learned at Harvard, what I've learned at Stanford, and tried to create something that's, in my mind at least, a happy amalgam of things I've learned from different cultures that I've been a part of.
That's very interesting. Let's also talk about your work because you mentioned how you design courseworks and how different cultures have influenced that. Talking about incentive and performance, I find your research and work to be super interesting and creative because you combine logic and math with psychology and incentive. And that's really the blending of both, cultural context that we've talked about. So, right off the bat, after studying incentives and performance in business for decades, what have you learned about humans?
So this is a particular branch of economics called information economics, where we try to model the human behavior as rational economic agents. And you can write down mathematically how people might behave in different circumstances. And then you have a game theoretic formulation where you look for an equilibrium in a game that is played between different players. My dissertation, my thesis dissertation at Stanford was modeling a game between trial lawyers and accounting firms because we want to understand the behavior of accounting firms and the impact of different kinds of legal regimes on the behavior of accountants. So it's a very powerful lens, a powerful way to study human behavior and how incentives shape human behavior. But over my career, over the last 30 years, I've learned that that is only, it's a very powerful but a partial view of what motivates human beings. Human beings are motivated by a whole range of other factors, peer recognition, patriotism, your love for your organization, leaving a legacy, a sense of accomplishment, or a sense of overcoming a challenge. All these are motivators. So I would say today, when I'm teaching in the classroom or telling my students or executives that are in my class, I try to focus on not just economic incentives, which are very powerful and very important, but also to think about the context and to think more broadly about how to motivate human beings. So that would be the broader lesson, I would say, to think about the context and think about incentives in that particular context.
So, in that context itself, talking about numbers and how numbers create incentives, that's a very non-intuitive thing. And so you have this working paper in which you talk about how employees with the knowledge of a customer's lifetime value are incentivized to give better customer service to the most profitable customers. You also have this YouTube video where you talk about how even non-finance professionals should understand accounting because that has an impact on their performance evaluation. So, on one hand, while we're talking about context, and on the other hand, while we're talking about how numbers create incentives, I'd love to know and learn how, in different contexts, different incentives become the motivators for humans and how that changes from one context to another.
Terrific question, Abhinav. So the one line answer to your question is what gets measured gets managed. Okay, so you would see settings, let's take a hospital and they start monitoring patient satisfaction. All of a sudden, you have these, surgeons who are on the top of their field, like world famous surgeons in one of the Harvard teaching hospitals, all of a sudden paying attention to parking. And you're like, why is a surgeon paying attention to parking? And they're like, my patients, if they come in to see me and if they found it difficult to find parking, they're in a bad mood and it shows up in my ratings. So I'm responsible end to end for my patient satisfaction. So I'm going to try and see what I can do about their parking situation, right? I'm just giving you a humorous anecdote. But the point of this is once you start measuring things and people are like, oh, my evaluation is going to be dependent on something new that wasn't being measured till last week, I better pay attention to it. And I'll manage that metric any which way I can. And if it means I have to go outside of what is usually in my, things that I control and make decisions about, if I have to engage in influencing behavior and lobbying my colleagues so that my metrics look better, I would do that. So that's the setting in which what gets measured gets managed. Now, there's another piece to it. It's not just what gets measured, but how it's used to impact your evaluation. It could be promotion decisions, it could be bonus, it could be straight compensation, it could be how do you rank peer relative to your peers, any of these things. But as long as there's a metric, all of a sudden people are like, okay, how do I come across in this metric? It's all of a sudden you start shining a light on one facet of a person's decision making or effort. And once they know they're on stage and the light is being shined on them, they try extra hard to maximize their how they're perceived, how they come across on that metric. And that's how the act of measurement changes people's behavior. Now, you refer to the context of measuring someone's lifetime value. What happens is that in prior interactions, they may not have been aware of that person's lifetime value or potential. So they might have been sort of like, you know, providing the level of service that they normally associate with the average person. But all of a sudden, if they know that this person's lifetime value is like very high, they might provide higher levels of service to that person or try harder to cross sell more products to that person because they know that now this is a high potential customer. So that's sort of how we react, or human beings react, when they're provided new metrics and new measurements, and they see, okay, what are the opportunities to maximize how I come across on this metric?
Yeah, that's an interesting take on the whole thing of how context influences numbers and how what gets measured gets managed. Do we know which numbers are the ones that really make people tick?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's part of this is the art in designing scorecards. What numbers should I pick? Very quickly you can escalate the number of metrics to, few hundred. And people cannot manage 200 metrics. You can measure it, so you can have something like, like in a pilot that is flying a plane. All of a sudden, if something goes below a certain level, you might have some alarms and beeps going off. So you can set up that for like 300 metrics such that if they're out of range, they pop into your screen and you have to pay attention. But that's not what you can be maximizing. You cannot pay attention to 300 metrics and say, I'm going to optimize all 300 of them.
Yeah.
I would say human attention span might be around 7 metrics. So between 5 and 10 metrics is what realistically people can simultaneously pay attention to. And so it's very important to pick those 5 to 10 metrics very carefully. So the key thing is to link every metric to the strategy of the organization and how this particular individual can influence through their own unique actions the overall strategy of the organization. And so therefore these metrics and scorecards should be very different from organization to organization, even in the same industry, if those two businesses have very different strategies. So how well your scorecard, your metrics reflect the strategy of the organization becomes extremely important while choosing these metrics. And that's sort of the creative aspect of designing incentive measures.
Yeah. Your work also goes into how franchise owners use measurement tools, like, as you just mentioned, the balanced scorecard, to mediate incentive frictions between franchisors and franchisees. Could you talk a bit more about that and the counterintuitive insight that you've probably gotten from this research over the years?
So, sometimes you're stopping on the highway and there is like a franchise, and you compare and contrast the service that you get there with what you might get in a local restaurant around your neighborhood. And you might notice that in the local neighborhood, they're paying more attention to the cleanliness, the service levels, compared to some restaurant which is on the highway, which is a franchise or an airport. And you stop and think about why that's the case. Now, if you're an individual franchisee on a highway, you're going to keep getting customers to your restaurant because of the brand recognition, because of all the advertising and marketing that's done by the franchisor at the brand level. So the individual franchisee is going to get this steady stream of customers, whereas this local restaurant is very dependent on their cleanliness, their levels of service,
Yeah.
the quality of the food, all of that. So what's basically happening is that the individual franchisees are saying that even if I cut corners in my cleanliness, how beautifully lit the restrooms are, my level of service, if I keep people waiting a little bit longer, that's okay because the effect of that is maybe felt by the whole brand, but I get the benefits of the rest of the brand too. So at the margin, people might be inclined to cut corners in a franchise or franchisee setting. Therefore, one of the most important roles of the franchisor is to guarantee sort of like a consistent level of service across all their outlets. So they have what they call mystery shopper programs and operational audits where they come unannounced and they check like 300 different metrics and see what is the cleanliness. Do you find little kids, you know, uh, uh, prints on the windows? Are the tables clean? All of these things, they have to periodically keep checking to make sure that the franchise has a very high level of quality. Things you take for granted in an individual restaurant happens in a franchisee setting only with these audits and mystery shopper programs. So that's sort of what I learned from my research, looking at these use of balance scorecards in this franchise or franchisee relationships.
That sort of takes me to this principal agent problem between employers and employees. So the natural follow-up to that is that how can we use this insight and say your learning, if you were to provide it to everybody who's watching this conversation, how can business leaders use this insight to improve other company dynamics?
Absolutely. So you want to be on the lookout for, things that we do as a team versus things that we do as an individual. Very often, if I'm doing something by myself and there are individual metrics available, this free rider problem, as we call it, is mitigated. But when we're working in a team and the output or the success depends on everyone pitching in, that's when we have to be extra careful for someone sort of free riding of the efforts of the team. We've all been in situations like this. So employers, while looking at designing scorecards, metrics, performance evaluation, want to be particularly aware where is it that we see more free rider problems, and those are precisely the places where we want to be more creative about designing metrics so that we can mitigate this free rider problem and align incentives.
Got it. Let's also talk about Harvard for a moment. We started off by saying that you've been at Harvard for 3 decades, and that is something that's super inspiring and also unique. In your experience, what do you find is the most unique thing about the Harvard MBA experience, and how, to an extent, can that be replicated by those who want to learn from the best, even though they may not have gone to Harvard?
So, what's unique about the Harvard Business School, what it's most famous for, is the case method. In fact, 2021, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the first case that was ever written, the General Shoe Company case. And that's what's distinctive about the Harvard Business School, that we tend to use, I think 300 cases a year in our MBA program. And, I think that's what makes Harvard distinctive. And but the case method travels very well. I went to IIM Ahmedabad where we used a lot of cases, and so I was very familiar with the case method before I showed up at HBS, and so I'm a strong proponent of the case method. You have Harvard Business Publishing, and we freely distribute, widely distribute. We sell our cases to schools all over the world, and all of them tend to buy cases from Harvard Business Publishing. So, I recently launched an online course that trains faculty on how to teach by the case method. So the case method is very widely accessible all around the world, even though it's sort of like what sets us apart, the love for other schools to adopt the case method.
Got it. I also like to think of the case method as a sort of business storytelling, which is a great way to learn concepts because they're all embedded, as we talked about, in a context. And you just talked about how HBR or HBS is distributing its cases and selling it to universities and people alike. And I also saw your video in which you said that you're excited to teach the case method because you don't know what's going to happen next, and that in a way you just let go. Can you talk a bit more about that part of the case method and how we can generalize that for a business or for other use cases? Think about storytelling or other elements of the case method which we can use for ourselves.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So, on first blush, it looks like a case is just a story, right? You're telling a story and you're trying to give some principles as part of the story. But what it actually is you're not just learning, you're learning how to learn. So, this is this double loop learning that sets apart the case method. So, what do I mean by that? I think, all of us, no matter which part of the world we come from, in India, we have something called the Panchatantra tales. You have the Arabian tales in the Middle East. You have the Aesop's fables in the Western countries. All of these are like stories. And then we start with young kids with these stories. And then we tell them, so what is the moral of the story? We even have an expression, moral of the story. And we have the Socratic method, which is presumably at least as old as Socrates, where you don't answer a person's question by saying, this is what you should do. You keep asking them questions till they figure out an answer for themselves. And that answer might differ from person to person. It sort of needs to reflect their priorities, their values. Now, the case method is where all of these things come together. We use a business situation, or usually a decision, and we say, what would you do? And in the classroom, we love to have debates where different students are saying, this is what I would do. Another student says, this is what I would do. And then we step back and we say, what did you learn from this exercise? How did what we learn in this particular company generalize outside of this company? And where do the insights hold and where do the insights not hold? That power of generalization, what we call inductive theory building, is the true skill that we're trying to hone through the case method. And that's a skill that stays with you long after you've left business school. You come to business school very often, 2 years MBA program, and then you go away and, it's not like the cases that you've learned or the principles that you've learned in class are going to stay with you for the rest of your career. You've probably forgotten most of what you learned within a year or two of leaving business school. But what stays with you is your ability to take a business situation, reduce it to sort of its core elements, reach a decision, but also look back and say, what did I learn from this? How do I generalize this? And how do I share my generalization with my fellow employees, with my customers, with my suppliers? And sort of like those become sort of your core operating principles and values by which you run your business. So much so, people might say, if Abhinav had been here at this meeting, this is what he would have said. Basically, what you're saying is that you've used all your experiences to crystallize learning and share it with your fellow employees and say, so much so they associate that learning with you. So that's sort of the power of the case method, where we want people to generalize, and this sets them up for their whole life, where they can continue to learn long after they left the business school.
That's a very interesting take, because we're talking about learning how to learn. And what really struck me from your answer is how HBS is teaching inductive theory learning, and how the ability to generalize from the case method allows students to specifically and uniquely apply that tacit knowledge that they've learned over the years in that new business situation. What do you think is the most valuable part of the case method? And it's been there for 100 years, and as we just talked about, we're not going to remember everything that we learned in business school, say after 2 years. But why does the case method still work? Why does it still matter?
Yeah, this is a great question. On the 100th anniversary of the very first case that we wrote, called the General Shoe Company case, we taught that case, a 100-year-old case. And it was still very relevant. People were still getting very into the case and actively debating what the company should be doing and what could probably be going on. So the method has got legs. It stands for a long time. I will be probably you and I won't be around, but I think the case method will be around for a few hundred years more. The reason for that is it's not like the body of knowledge remains static. So even the old case that I've been teaching for 30 years, I might still teach that again, is that the context changes, business practices changes, technology evolves, people's taste and preferences evolve, skill sets evolve. And in the new context, new students take the same situation and interpret it very differently and often reach different conclusions or offer different solutions. So some of these things are eternal. If you can look past the fact that some of these dollar amounts are like, what, who's getting paid $1 an hour, because the case is maybe 80 years old. That might have been the
Yeah.
prevailing wages a long time ago. But if you can look past that and go to the concept, some of these cases still have legs. But we continue to write hundreds of new cases every year. We have videos and we're listening to the protagonists of the company talk in those videos, and we often get the protagonists of the company come to our classroom through a Zoom meeting. So case method has evolved and it'll continue to evolve, but at its core, I think it serves a very fundamental purpose and it'll be here for a long, long time.
That's what you're referring to is, in effect, the Lindy effect, which is what Nassim Taleb calls that if something has existed for 100 years, it will continue to exist for another 100 years. So that's a very interesting sort of piece of insight over there. Are there some specific cases that you think you have loved teaching or that the students have loved the most?
So I love teaching the case that my colleague Bob Simons wrote on performance evaluation at Citibank. On paper, that case is about you're required to do the performance evaluation for a branch manager for one of the Citibank branches. And the students have to rate the manager on a bunch of criteria like customer satisfaction, strategy implementation, financial performance, all of that on below par, par, above par. That's the assignment. And that's the decision they have to make and then give an overall rating. And when they come to class, we'll always have this very heated debate between one section of the class that is like, very favorably inclined, even though he's missed some targets on customer satisfaction. They find all kinds of problems with how that metric has been measured, and therefore they want to give him the highest possible rating and the maximum bonus. And then there's another set of people that are like, no, you stick to the rules. The guy didn't reach his metrics. Don't use your discretion to boost his ratings, and they just want to give him a lower rating and a lower bonus. And then we step back and say, what happened here? We all read the same case. Why did we reach such different conclusions? And in fact, what students realize through the process is that they decided what overall rating to give that guy and then work backwards to say how they're going to rate him on strategy implementation or customer satisfaction. And that's a very generalizable insight. Very often, fall in love with people that we like, projects that we like. So we have some pet projects, some proteges that we are trying to promote in the organization, and they can do no wrong. Those projects can never be too ugly. So we fall in love with certain people and certain projects, and then we work backwards to tell a story about how they're so awesome. And the converse is also true. Sometimes we don't give some people a fair chance. Being aware of our own biases this way is important. And having someone who can challenge your ratings and says, VG, you're giving this project high marks or this person high marks because you seem to like them. And you're giving low marks to this person because you don't like them. You're not being objective. First, we have to admit to the possibility that as human beings, we are not always objective. And second, we need to take help from our peers who challenge us and say, listen, VG, you need to be more objective. And that's sort of how we improve our own performance evaluation processes in our organizations.
That's very nice. Having taught students for so many years, is there one unexpected lesson that your students have taught you over the years?
I'm always marveling and I'm always amazed how much listening and listening with empathy to your students can do for what it can do for the classroom learning. Very often there is somebody saying something, there's a comment, but there's a comment behind the comment that shaped the comment. There is experience there. They're coming at this because of certain life experiences, certain values. And your job in the classroom is to listen very attentively so that you can unlock those insights, so that others can see where the student is coming from. Now, if you go into the classroom and you say, this is what I'm going to tell my student, this is the learning from today's class, you're not listening. You are trying to say, how do I can take their words and morph it into what I want them to say? That's like
Yeah.
a very bad way to be a professor, to be a teacher. You need to be genuinely curious about what your students have to say. And
Yeah.
once you leave your ego out of the picture and it's all about you're being curious about what different students have to say and why they're saying different things, you can have a terrific classroom discussion and you can have generalizable learnings that come out of that discussion. So the counterintuitive insight or something that you have to really change your habit is to resist your temptation to jump in and say, here's what I think the company should do. Your job is
Got it.
to elicit different perspectives in the classroom. And that's sort of the case method at its most powerful best.
That's a very interesting segment of this discussion and leads me very, very fluidly into this new thing that I'm thinking about is that how do people at HBS really think about things and how do they view things? So I'm curious about the mental models and the kinds of thinking tools that a place like Harvard equips you with. So I'd love to ask you, how do you see things? How do you think about them and make sense of the chaos and the order out there in the world?
That's a great question, and I spent a lot of time reflecting on that. I think there are, you know, subconsciously, all of us try to make sense of the world by seeing patterns,
Yeah.
and those patterns are mapped into our prior models of the world or frameworks that A causes B. If you see this happening, then this will follow. These are all like theories and hypotheses that we have honed over years with our life experience, maybe what we have learned, what we have studied, and we are trying to take data as it comes in, observations as they come in, and map that into some of these things and say, I think this is what's going on, this is my diagnosis, therefore this is the what I should be doing here. But there is another level of learning where we are saying, do the old frameworks still work? Because, like we talked about before, life is changing, technology is changing, people's preferences are changing, attitudes are changing, fashions are changing. Therefore, maybe the old frameworks don't work so well, right? So we might need to come up and create new frameworks for ourselves. So constantly we are both sort of like fitting the world into old patterns, but also asking, maybe those patterns aren't the best ways to predict what's going to happen. You might need a new framework. So I think that's what happens. I don't think that's unique to HBS or unique to my students or unique to us. All of us do that. It depends on sort of like how good you are at staying truthful to your prior frameworks and how good you are at creating new frameworks, new mental models for yourself, and what is the right time to switch. Luck plays an important role, but there's also personal habits. There's some people that always believe that tomorrow is a completely brand new different world and none of the old rules apply, and then there are others
Yeah.
that say, yeah, it's always old wine in new bottle. Everything that we see today has happened before in history,
Yeah.
and all of us are probably somewhere in between.
So I think there's this latent desire in folks at HBS or such universities who want to explore the world and really question the old assumptions rather than find patterns and then just stay with it, or rather seek patterns and not stay with the existing knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. See, what happens is that, if you look at how a child views the world, versus how
Yeah.
adults we might look at the world. We keep resorting to, in fact, the older we get, we keep saying, in good old days, in my time, this is what we used to do. And look at children these days, they have, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. You give a list of things that are wrong with the world. Now, simultaneously, you have to appreciate this is the childhood for these kids. And 50 years from now, they're going to be making similar comments about how awesome their childhood was. And Well, that's human nature, right?
Yeah,
When we have the whole world to look forward to, we're more eager to learn and be more receptive to new frameworks, new data, new ideas, and we're willing to learn. Whereas someone who is like resisting that, fighting that, who's harking back on the good old days, what they're implicitly saying is that I'm not that eager to learn. That I'm
yeah,
not being allowing myself to be that plastic, and allowing myself to learn from new experiences, and that's why they go to the comfort of the known and the past rather than
yeah,
embrace changes in the future. So to be a lifelong learner, that would be the goalpost for me.
yeah,
To see
yeah,
everyone be a lifelong learner.
yeah. Talking about the past and the future and patterns and how we think, you've taught for so many years at Harvard and you've taught so many cases, and yet how you said that in 2021 you taught the first case that was taught in Harvard, and that's something that I find very interesting. My question is that you said that despite teaching a thing for say 40 times, you always end up learning something new because you're interacting with students and you're generally curious. How do you see the same problem but differently every time?
So part of what we're trying to get our students to learn is how to formulate the problem. Very often in life, if you knew what the problem was, coming up with the solution might be easy. But
Yeah,
formulating the problem is the hard part. So when I go into a classroom, I try not to be the person formulating the problem for the students. I go in there and ask the students, what do you think this case is about? What do you think the CEO should do? And when you leave it to the students, each succeeding generation of students will view the case through a different prism, through a different lens, and they'll formulate the problem itself very differently. And therefore,
yeah,
it's no surprise that they'll reach different conclusions. So it's sort of like if you stay true to the case method and you trust your students, and every time the students are coming with different set of life experience to the classroom, it should be no surprise then they will view the world differently and they'll reach different conclusions. That's the excitement for me. My students keep me young at heart. They keep me learning. They keep teaching me new things.
yeah.
And I just have to go into the classroom with a childlike curiosity and a sense of wonderment, and then the students take over from there.
Let's switch gears for a bit. Some of your recent work has focused on cost management and control in the healthcare sector. You talked about how surgeons were interested in parking. And this is especially relevant as we just come out of COVID. I'm curious about how you think how costs, accounting, incentives, and performance evaluation for that matter play a role directly in the delivery of healthcare.
So, I'm more familiar with healthcare delivery in US and in
Yeah,
India. So I'll talk about the contrast and lessons we can learn by comparing and contrasting these two. In the US right now, healthcare has reached 20% of the GDP of the United States. Um, Yet the outcomes in the US are not as good as they are in other OECD countries where they seem to be spending a smaller percentage of the GDP on healthcare and getting as good or probably even better outcomes than we do in the US. So that's just it's a challenge. It's a problem for the United States that it's spending so much of its GDP on healthcare and not getting as good outcomes.
yeah,
And it can be a competitive disadvantage in the long run. Um, Shifting to India, the costs aren't that high, but the healthcare outcomes have a lot of room for improvement for life expectancies and things like that to catch up to what is possible for the human race. So both countries have room for improvement. In the US, I think the focus has got to be on sort of like uh, more efficiency in healthcare delivery. In India, the importance is for more effectiveness to realize more of the upside. I think both the countries have these challenges. In the US, in particular, we can ask the question, why does it cost so much to deliver healthcare? And you realize there are a lot of challenges. For instance, hospitals do a terrible job of measuring the cost of various things. So they're used to getting reimbursed and passing on the bill to insurance companies. And so they really haven't had as much incentive to control costs. US is quite a litigious society. So physicians practice a lot of defensive medicine, and so they order a whole bunch of tests that may really not be that necessary, and therefore, their costs go up because you're ordering all these tests that are not so necessary, but you want to be
Yeah.
seen as having done them, so that in a lawsuit you can say, I was very thorough, I checked all these 100 things, even though they're small probability events. Then there is also end of life care, like, large percentage, up to one third of a person's healthcare costs are incurred in their last year of their life. So these are all
Yeah.
situations where that contribute to the healthcare costs ballooning in the US. There is also a free rider problem, some things we have talked about before, be created by insurance, which is sort of like you want to protect people from suddenly being stuck with a big medical bill. But it also means that because it's being reimbursed, people ask for more tests and they're like, can I have this test? Can I have that test? And physicians are paid per service. Like every time you go to them and you say, I have this problem, and they fix you up, they get paid. So
Yeah.
nobody here has the incentives to keep you healthy on a continuous basis, not the physicians. Wouldn't it be better if we had a system where physicians are paid for keeping you healthy, and not for making you fall sick? Or, I mean, I don't think they're paid for making you fall sick, but they should. So there are
Yeah.
incentive problems, there are cost allocation problems, cost measurement problems, throughout the healthcare industry in the US. And in India, it's a slightly different problem in terms of effectiveness. How do we sweat the assets more, right? The
Yeah.
utilization of assets is like much better in India. So those are the lessons. So I think the two countries can learn quite a bit from each other. For instance, in India right now, I think the need for the R is to focus on public health. Something like for the Center for Disease Control, there is monitoring in the information age. It'll be incredibly powerful to monitor how diseases are being transmitted, how they're spreading across the population, and what we could do centrally as a society to mitigate the challenges of public health. And in the US, they can learn so much from hospitals in India. For instance, I wrote a paper where I compared the cost of heart surgery in one of the leading hospitals in India with two leading hospitals in the US. You can separate out wage differences. That's easy. But even controlling for that, you see that the hospital in India is so much more efficient for comparable outcomes. And the reason is that they were sweating their assets much more. They were getting a lot
Yeah.
more utilization of their assets. So those are lessons that we can learn by doing this compare and contrast. And those learnings go in both directions.
That's such an interesting set of insights about the differences of the healthcare system, differences between the healthcare system of India and that of the US. Let's dig a bit deeper there. In one of the papers, you've also talked about how family support in India lowers healthcare costs to an extent, and why healthcare costs are high in the US for that specific reason as well. Could you talk a bit more about the differences in how numbers incentivize cost decisions and pricing decisions, and more in a US and Indian context?
Yeah, so for example, post-surgery recovery, it's very common in India to give instructions to family members, or food. There are so much variety in dietary restrictions in India for patients that very often the food might come from home.
Yeah.
Versus US, it tends to be standardized, and you get hospital food, and no one seems to like hospital food. There isn't much of a role for families, because families tend to move far. When it's very normal, when your kids grow up, they find a job in a different city. I mean, India is also moving in that direction, but less so. I think families tend to stay together more, and therefore the support of the family is more readily available. The extended family very often is readily available to help patients recuperate. That leads to improvement in compliance, leads to a reduction in healthcare costs, and leads to better outcomes for that particular reason. So, use of families in changing how much it costs to treat a patient, you see the stark difference. Sorry, I may not have done justice to your question. Can you repeat that question if I didn't fully address it?
No, I think by giving these examples in terms of how the cost decisions and pricing decisions, both in the Indian and American context, incentivize people to think about costs and how that has an impact on the system really answers, for example, in the context of the food, as you mentioned. But if there's something you'd like to add,
Yeah, I'd
please
like
do
to
so.
give you another anecdote. When I was visiting India, this is many, many years ago, maybe 12, 15 years ago, my father, who's no more, but he fell down and broke his hip. He fractured his hip, so he had to have a hip replacement surgery. So I went to the hospital, and they asked me, like, what room would you like for your dad? And they gave me a menu card. And they were like, multiple categories, maybe like 10 categories of rooms. And of course, they all varied in their price, their tariff. I asked, what's the difference? This one has got a room for your guest, and it's got two flat screen TVs. This one has got only one flat screen TV. This is air conditioned, not air conditioned, all the things that you might expect. But I noticed an unusual feature: how much they charge you for the medicine, how much they charge you for the surgery, how much they might charge you for imaging, like X-ray, depends on which room you're staying in. If you choose more of the high-end room, you're going to pay more, not just for the room, but for all the services that the hospital might provide. Initially, as a customer, I looked at this and said, that doesn't seem fair. But then I put on my hat as like an applied economist, and I said, this actually makes sense. What they're doing is in economics what we call price discrimination.
Yeah.
And they're using knowledge, the fact that you value comforts more, to charge you more and presumably subsidize or cross subsidize people that can't afford to pay as much. So it's like a way within the same hospital to serve different clienteles and sort of get more economies of scale. So I think it makes perfect sense, but it's just not something I'd used to. And till you think about it that way, your first reaction is always to think about, is this fair? So,
Yeah.
this is like a market innovation that I had not seen. And I was like actually quite impressed with what I saw in that particular hospital in India.
Dr. Narayanan, this has been a pleasure. As we wrap up, I want to ask you two last questions. Having spent so much time at Harvard and looking back at when you started in Chennai, then moved to IIM, then to Stanford, and then to Harvard, what's something you know now that you wish you knew back then?
I was growing up, I was chasing academic success, professional success in my career. I look back on it and I wish I'd spent a little bit more time looking in the mirror and asking myself, what makes you more happy? It's not that I would have
Yeah.
changed anything in my career, but I might live my life moment to moment a little differently. I now realize what makes me happy is not my financial success, my career, my professional achievements, but it's these moments where I've had the opportunity to help others, maybe my students, maybe my family, maybe strangers. And I wish I'd paid more attention to it. And I hope to remedy that for the rest of my life, is to not lose opportunities to help others. You want to grab those opportunities with both hands, because life is short and opportunities to help others don't come by that often. And paying a little bit more attention to that is sort of what I would say I wish I had known 30 years ago about myself.
Thank you. Thank you again. And finally, as we look forward, if you were to somewhat distill your learnings in this field and from Harvard Business School, what advice would you offer to our young leaders for business and for life today?
I get this request from a lot of my students, former students, uh, and even children of my friends. And the main thing that I tell people is that life is so full of opportunities. It's very difficult today to plan 30 years into the future about your career, because then you might miss out on opportunities that don't even exist today that are going to arise. You need to be somewhat flexible and nimble. So, what you can do is put yourself in the company of good people and put yourself in good institutions and good organizations and commit to a lifetime of learning, but sort of be opportunistic about taking advantages of new opportunities that show up sort of at any point in your life. And that sense of like discovery and joy, where you're always willing to zig and zag with your career, is, I think, the wave of the future. Rather than say, I'm going to get this job, I'm set for the next 40 years, that sort of like is not the way you want to be
Yeah.
thinking about your career.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Narayanan. A pleasure to have spoken with you.
Thank you, Abhinav. I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you. Thank you.